Today, we uncover the shocking truth about UK beef mince, and what's hiding in your fridge right now might honestly turn your stomach. There's a trick the meat industry uses that most people have never heard of. It's called modified potato starch, and it's not the kind of potato you're picturing in your head. This is a heavily processed derivative, and it's engineered for one job and one job only: to soak up and hold on to water that's been pumped into meat. Think of it a bit like a nappy. The starch granules swell up, lock that water inside the muscle fibers, and the meat looks firm, looks fresh, looks completely normal sitting there on the shelf. You'd never know anything was different just by looking at it. But the moment that meat hits a hot pan, the heat breaks the starch down, the trick stops working, and all that trapped water comes flooding out. That grey liquid pooling around your mince isn't meat juice. A lot of it is tap water that you paid beef prices for. Now, some shoppers have actually gone and peeled back the front label on certain beef products in major supermarkets, and underneath, in tiny print, they found ingredients lists that read something like beef 90%, water, salt, potato starch, potato fiber. On a product where you'd expect just one ingredient, beef, 90% means 1 in every 10 bites isn't beef at all. And here's the bit that should really wind you up. None of this is hidden from the law. It's all technically listed somewhere. It's just listed somewhere you'll need a magnifying glass, tucked under a fold-out label that almost nobody's ever going to peel back in the middle of a busy shop with a trolley full of kids and a queue forming behind them. Some of the packs we're going to talk about today lose almost half their weight the moment they hit the pan. Picture buying a 500-gram pack of mince, putting it in a hot pan, and watching close to a third of it disappear into a grey puddle before you've even started cooking properly, the same amount of liquid as a full can of fizzy drink, gone, never destined to be your dinner. So today we've gone through the major beef mince brands currently sold in UK supermarkets, and we're going to expose the 11 products you need to avoid. Then we'll tell you the handful that are actually still worth putting in your trolley. Before we get into all that, if you've ever stood at the hob watching your mince boil instead of brown and wondered what you were doing wrong, do me a favor and hit that hype button right now. I know it sounds like a tiny thing, but honestly, it's the only reason videos like this end up in front of more people instead of getting buried under adverts and glossy supermarket marketing. Every single hype that this video gets helps push it in front of someone else, maybe someone who's been buying the exact same pack every week for years without ever knowing any of this. That's not nothing. That's how this kind of pressure actually builds. That's how supermarkets end up changing what they put on the shelves, because enough ordinary people started asking questions and stopped staying quiet about it. So go on, hit that hype button now before you forget, and let's get into it. Number 11. Tesco's 20% fat beef mince. This is the one almost everyone in the country has bought at some point, because Tesco is the biggest supermarket in Britain, and this sits right there on the shelf with cozy wording about trusted farmers and family dinners. The packaging wants you picturing rolling green fields and a farmer in wellies who personally knows every cow by name. Now, let's be clear about something before we go any further. 20% fat in mince isn't automatically a bad thing. Fat gives mince its flavour, its juiciness, and plenty of you watching probably prefer a higher fat mince precisely because lean mince can end up dry and a bit tasteless. That's a completely fair preference, and we're not here to tell you fat is the enemy. The problem with this pack isn't the fat number printed on the front, it's what happens when you actually cook it. Put this mince in a hot pan expecting it to sear and brown the way mince used to, and instead you'll watch it start to boil. Within a couple of minutes, there's a pool of grey liquid spreading across the bottom of the pan, and the meat just sits there steaming in it rather than browning. One shopper described draining off close to 300 millilitres of liquid from a single 1.5 kilogram batch. That's nearly a full can of fizzy drinks worth of liquid sat in your pan that you paid beef prices for. So you're not being let down because the mince has fat in it. You're being sold a product where a chunk of that pack's weight is liquid that was never going to end up on your plate, all dressed up with language that makes you picture a small family farm. My mum always used to say, when you're cooking mince, brown it until you get that proper steaky smell. Try getting that steaky smell out of this. It just doesn't happen anymore. Number 10. Sainsbury's British or Irish 25% fat beef mince. Read that again. 25%. A quarter of the pack, by law, is allowed to be fat. Not 5%, not 10%, not even the 20% that's already considered the upper end for standard mince. A quarter. Now again, if you're someone who actively wants more fat in your mince for the flavor, that's your call. And there's nothing wrong with that choice in principle. But here's the bit that should bother you regardless of how you feel about fat. This isn't being sold to you as a fat-focused product. It's sitting in the normal mince section, right next to the standard packs, looking like completely ordinary, everyday family food. Most people walking past have no idea this particular pack sits right at the legal ceiling, because nothing about the shelf, the price, or the packaging tells you that. And once it hits the pan, that quarter of fat doesn't all stay there as flavor. A huge amount of it renders straight out, along with whatever moisture the mince is holding, leaving you with a noticeably smaller portion than the pack suggested and a thin layer of grease across the whole hob that you'll be wiping off for the rest of the evening. The scariest thing about this one isn't that it's some weird niche product hiding in the corner, it's that it's completely normal. It's the one that millions of people in this country pick up every single week without a second thought, because it looks exactly like every other pack of mince around it. Number 9. Asda's Just Essentials Beef Mince. This is the one aimed squarely at families trying to get dinner on the table while watching every penny, and with the cost of living the way it's been, that's most of us at some point. The bright yellow packaging practically shouts that you're being sensible. Here's where it gets interesting. Asda's own product information states a typical collagen to meat protein ratio of up to 25%. Now, collagen is just a polite way of describing connective tissue, sinew, and gristle. The official benchmark for what's supposed to count as proper pure beef mince sits at 15%. This product is allowed to push that number up to 25%. What that means in practice is that a noticeably bigger chunk of what's in this pack isn't muscle meat at all. It's the tougher, chewier bits that get trimmed away from better cuts, the parts that don't soften no matter how long you cook them. Fry this up and you'll start noticing little white rubbery flecks that never break down properly no matter how long it sits in the pan. And here's something that's come up again and again from people online. Several shoppers have mentioned that their dogs, animals that will normally eat absolutely anything that hits the kitchen floor, have turned their nose up at this particular mince. Now, dogs don't care about packaging or branding. They've got no loyalty to any supermarket whatsoever. So when an animal that'll happily eat off the floor decides this isn't worth its time, that's worth paying attention to. The most vulnerable shoppers, the ones who can least afford to be messed about with, are the ones being pointed straight at this shelf. Number 8. Morrison's British Beef Mince, 20% fat. Morrison's has spent decades building an image as the food maker and shopkeeper, the supermarket that used to have its own butchers working behind a counter you could actually see through. For a lot of people over 50, that image still carries real weight. It feels like the safe choice, the one that's closer to how things used to be done. But since 2021, Morrison's has been owned by a private equity group called Fortress Investment Group, and that kind of ownership change tends to come with serious financial pressure on every single part of the business, including what they're willing to pay farmers for the cattle that ends up in this mince. When farmers get squeezed on price, something has to give somewhere down the line, and it's rarely the supermarket's own profit margin that takes the hit. What shoppers have reported noticing with this particular mince is the color. Rather than that vibrant red you'd expect from fresh beef, it often looks pale, almost grayish, even when it's well within its date. On top of that, there have been repeated reports of an off smell when the pack is first opened. Not a smell that necessarily means the meat has gone off, but that slightly sour, slightly metallic smell that makes you stop and double-check the date before you commit to cooking it. When people are routinely smelling something a bit wrong on a product that's still well within date and binning it just to be safe, that's not one unlucky shopper having a bad day. That's a pattern. And it's happening on a brand that built its entire reputation on being the one supermarket that still understood proper butchery. Number 7. Tesco's 20% fat beef mince, the frozen 1 kilogram bags. This one's aimed at the freezer fillers, the families doing a big batch cook, the people stocking up because it's convenient and it lasts for months. And on the surface that makes sense. Buy in bulk, freeze it, use it as needed. Here's the thing though, turn the bag over and read the cooking instructions properly. It tells you to drain well before serving. Sit with that for a second. A multi-billion-pound supermarket is printing, in writing, an instruction telling you to pour liquid away before you can even serve the meal. Ask yourself what exactly you're draining. That liquid isn't seasoning, it's not stock. It's water that ended up in this product somewhere along the way, and when you drain it, you're literally watching part of what you paid for go straight down the sink. On top of that, freezing and thawing does something to meat that a lot of people don't think about. When meat freezes, ice crystals form inside the muscle cells, and those crystals actually puncture the cell walls. So when this mince thaws out, all that moisture the cells were holding onto just escapes straight away, before it's even gone near the pan. Combine that with 20% fat that's also going to render out during cooking, and you can understand why a 1 kilo bag can shrink down to something that barely fills 2 plates. This is being marketed as the smart, economical choice for big families. But when the official instructions on the packet are telling you to drain your dinner before you eat it, that's not really economical. That's just water with a beef-flavored price tag. Number 6. Marks & Spencer's Select Farms Beef Mince, 20% fat. M&S has built its entire identity around the idea that their food is a step above farms we know and trust. That's the phrase they use, and it works because shoppers genuinely do feel like they're trading up when they choose M&S over the supermarket next door, and they're happy to pay more for that feeling. But here's what that premium price is actually buying you. Even their Select Farms range, the one with the elegant black packaging and the reassuring language, still comes in at around 16.5 grams of fat and over 7 grams of saturates per 100 grams. Those numbers are genuinely not far off the budget 20% packs sitting in supermarkets a fraction of the price. And the bigger issue is where this mince actually comes from. Despite the elegant packaging, M&S Select Farms beef still passes through the same large-scale, high-throughput processing plants that supply other major supermarkets. The cattle aren't coming from some small, dedicated M&S-only farm down the road. They're going through the exact same industrial system, the same grinding, the same packing lines as everything else on this list. So what you're really paying that extra money for isn't a meaningfully different product, it's the packaging, the lighting in the shop, and the feeling that you've made a better choice. And look, feeling good about your shopping isn't nothing. But if you're on a tight budget and choosing this over a cheaper pack purely because you think it's a different tier of meat entirely, you should know that the gap is a lot smaller than the price difference suggests. Number 5. Iceland's Frozen Beef Mince. Iceland has been a fixture on British high streets since the 70s, and for a lot of people, especially those keeping a close eye on the budget, it's the go-to for stocking the freezer. Bags of mince, ready whenever you need them, no rush to use it before it goes off. Remember that potato starch trick we talked about at the start, the one designed to lock water inside meat so it looks firm right up until it hits the heat? Cheaper frozen mince products are exactly the kind of thing that legal classification was built around. Some bargain frozen minces are categorized not as pure beef, but as what's called a beef preparation. And that classification allows the manufacturer to add water along with binders like starch or flour to hold that water in place. It's all listed on the pack. It's just not the first thing you notice when you're grabbing a bag from the freezer aisle in a hurry with a trolley full of other shopping. Defrost one of these bags and have a proper look at what's sitting in the bottom of the tray before you even start cooking. For a lot of shoppers, that's been a real eye-opener. There's often a surprising amount of liquid pooling there, liquid that was frozen solid inside the meat and is now just sitting in the tray, never destined to become part of your dinner. Then there's the labeling itself. British and Irish beef covers an enormous range, from premium grass-fed cattle right down to the cheapest trimmings available anywhere on either island. At Iceland's price point, it's not exactly a mystery which end of that range this mince is likely sitting at. You're trusting a label that technically tells you nothing specific at all. Number 4. Aldi's Ashfield's British Beef Mince, 20% fat. Aldi has spent years building a reputation for matching the quality of the bigger supermarkets at a noticeably lower price. And for a lot of products, that reputation is genuinely earned. People trust Aldi now in a way they didn't a decade ago. And again, let's say it clearly, if you're after that 20% fat content because you love the flavor it brings, fair enough. The question with this one isn't whether fat is good or bad, it's what kind of fat you're actually getting for your money. To hit a price point this low, this mince leans heavily on cheap external trimming fat, the scraps taken off the outside of carcasses during processing. That kind of fat behaves very differently to the firmer internal fat you'd get from a quality cut. External fat breaks down faster in storage, a process called lipolysis, and the result is that the moment you pierce the film on this pack, plenty of shoppers have described a distinct, slightly metallic, almost rancid smell hitting them straight away. Not spoiled exactly, but definitely not the clean, beefy smell you'd want from something you're about to feed your family. So if you are buying this because you want that higher fat content, here's the honest question worth asking yourself. Are you actually getting good quality beef fat, the kind that renders down beautifully and adds real flavor? Or are you getting a fifth of the pack made up of cheap scrap fat that's already starting to turn before you've even opened it? Because those are two very different things, and only one of them is actually worth paying for. Number 3. Lidl's Birchwood British Beef Mince. Lidl took longer than Aldi to win over older British shoppers, but it's got there now, and the Birchwood range is their standard, everyday own brand. A few years back, Lidl switched a lot of this range over to vacuum-sealed packaging, the tightly compressed, airtight wraps instead of the looser trays with a bit of give in them. They framed it as a win for the environment, less plastic, less waste, same great quality. Shoppers haven't really agreed with that last part. There's been a steady stream of comments describing the texture of this vacuum-packed mince as slimy, dense, and unpleasant compared to how it used to be in the old-style trays. Some people have said it makes them feel a bit off just opening the pack before they've even started cooking anything. Then there's the color. Like most supermarket mince, this is packed using a gas mixture that keeps the surface looking bright red for far longer than meat naturally would. In the old days, meat that had been sitting around for a while would turn a duller brown, and that was actually useful information. It told you something about how long it had been there. With this kind of packaging, the outside can stay looking fresh and red, while the meat underneath is aging away completely out of sight. The color stops being a useful signal and starts being a bit of a mask. On top of that, trials looking at meat stored in this type of gas packaging for extended periods have found it can lose a noticeable amount of tenderness compared to meat that hasn't been treated this way, even when it still looks perfectly fine on the shelf. So you could be buying something that looks identical to last week's pack and getting a noticeably tougher result in the pan, with absolutely no way of knowing in advance. Number 2. Ocado's own brand beef mince, 20% fat. Ocado doesn't have physical shops, so there's no wandering past a butcher's counter, no seeing anyone actually handling meat. Everything about how this product is presented to you happens through a screen, and the language Ocado uses leans hard into that. Their listing describes this as coming from selected cuts that are higher in fat, specifically so the mince is succulent, tender, and richly flavored. That sounds lovely. But strip away the language, and what you're left with is a product that, by their own description, sits at 20% fat with a collagen-to-meat protein ratio that can run close to the upper legal limit for standard mince. In other words, it's not meaningfully different from the budget packs sitting on physical supermarket shelves. It's the same kind of product, with noticeably nicer words attached to it. Because you're buying this without ever seeing or touching it before it arrives, you're relying entirely on Ocado's description to set your expectations. And when that description leans on words like succulent and richly flavored, a lot of shoppers go in expecting something closer to a treat, a step up from their usual supermarket mince. Then it turns up, and in the pan, it behaves exactly like every other 20% fat mince we've already talked about today. Liquid pools, the meat shrinks, and any sense that this was a more special product disappears along with the steam. Online shopping in general gets a lot less scrutiny than a physical shop, simply because there's no shelf for anyone to stand in front of and compare packs side by side. That makes the gap between the description and the reality even easier to miss. Number 1. And here's the one that might genuinely surprise you, because it's not the high-fat pack that takes the top spot. It's Tesco's 5% fat beef mince, the vacuum-packed version, sometimes described as the new, more eco-friendly format. Tesco promoted this change as a genuinely good thing, cutting plastic packaging by a significant amount while keeping the meat just as fresh. And reducing plastic is obviously a good aim. Nobody's arguing against that part of it. But here's what that vacuum sealing process actually does to the mince itself. To get the meat into that tight brick-shaped pack, it has to be compressed under serious pressure. That pressure crushes the delicate strands of meat together into something closer to a dense, gelatinous block than loose mince. Once it's been through that process, it doesn't really go back to being separate strands again, no matter how much you break it up with a spoon before cooking. Put this in a pan, and instead of getting that familiar loose, crumbly texture mince is supposed to have, you end up with something closer to a single solid sheet that breaks apart into rubbery clumps rather than fine pieces. People have described the result as feeling more like a dense, processed paste than proper minced beef, the kind of texture you'd associate with the cheapest tinned pet food rather than something you'd serve up in a bolognese or a cottage pie. So this is the genuinely strange twist in all of this. The lowest fat option on our entire list, the one you'd assume is the safest, healthiest choice, is the one that's had its actual structure as a piece of meat altered the most. Going low fat didn't fix anything here, it just swapped one problem for a completely different one. So that's the 11 to steer clear of. Now, before you write off beef mince completely, here's the good news. There are still options out there that genuinely behave the way mince used to, that sear instead of steam, that don't shrink to nothing in the pan, and that don't leave you wondering what exactly you just fed your family. Here's where to look. First, Waitrose Essential British Beef Mince, 12% fat. This one sits in a really sensible middle ground. It's not so lean that it ends up dry and tasteless, but it's nowhere near the 25% ceiling we talked about earlier either. Coming in at around 12 grams of fat per 100 grams, with around 4.5 grams of saturates, it gives you enough fat for proper flavor without the pan turning into a swimming pool. The label is also refreshingly simple. British beef, listed at 100% with none of the added water or binding tricks we've spent most of this video talking about. For anyone who's found 5% mince a bit dry and joyless, but doesn't want to go all the way up to a quart of fat, this is the kind of pack that splits the difference properly, and it's still sitting at a price most households can actually justify. Second, Marks & Spencer's Aberdeen Angus 5% lean mince. This is a genuinely different tier from the Select Farms range we mentioned earlier. The collagen to meat protein ratio on this one is stated as under 12%, well below even the official benchmark for pure beef mince. That means what you're getting is overwhelmingly proper muscle meat, ground from genuinely lean cuts, rather than padded out with the connective tissue and gristle that drags down so many budget packs. If you're someone who does want a leaner mince, but you've been put off by how dry and crumbly cheap lean mince usually turns out, this is the one worth trying instead. The Aberdeen Angus breed is known for marbling well, even at lower overall fat percentages, so you still get a decent amount of flavor without the pan filling up with grease. Third, Waitrose's #1 organic Aberdeen Angus beef mince, or their native breed 5% range, depending on which one you find on the shelf. Both of these come from single breed cattle that are properly grass-fed, and the trimmings are coarsely ground rather than forced through under the kind of high pressure that crushes the structure of the meat. The way we saw with the vacuum-packed Tesco mince earlier, that coarser grind means the meat actually sears properly. You get a real crust forming in the pan, rather than that grey steamed effect. This is genuinely closer to what mince looked and behaved like decades ago, before all the processing shortcuts we've talked about today became standard practice. It costs more, there's no pretending otherwise, but for a special dinner, or for anyone who's had enough of grey puddles in the pan, it's worth knowing this option exists on a normal supermarket shelf, no special trip required. Fourth, and this one isn't a supermarket brand at all, it's your local high street butcher, and specifically, somewhere like the Ginger Pig if you're near one of their shops, though the same applies to any proper independent butcher near you. The big difference here is dry aging. A traditional butcher will hang beef for up to 28 days before it's minced, and that process naturally allows excess moisture to evaporate out of the meat over time, while concentrating the flavor. The result is mince with essentially no added water, no gas flushing, and fat that's clean, firm, and genuinely tastes of something. Plenty of people have said the same thing after switching, that it crumbles properly in the pan, the way they remember mince crumbling when they were younger, and that there's finally that proper steaky smell back in the kitchen again. If you can find a good independent butcher near you, even just for the occasional special meal, it's worth asking them exactly what's gone into their mince. A proper butcher will be able to tell you straight away, no peeling back any labels required. Fifth, Daylesford Organic Grass-Fed Beef Mince. This is fully traceable organic pasture-raised beef, processed in much smaller batches than anything coming out of the major industrial plants we've talked about today. Because the cattle are entirely grass-fed, the fat has a noticeably different, cleaner profile. And a lot of people who've tried it describe it as tasting properly rich without any of that slightly metallic or chemical aftertaste that's become so normal in supermarket mince that most of us don't even notice it anymore until we taste the difference. It's a premium product, and it's not going to be a weekly shop item for most households, and that's completely fine. But it's worth knowing it exists, both as an option for when you want to treat yourself and as a reminder of what beef mince is actually supposed to taste like underneath all the water, the starch, the gas, and the marketing. And that's the rundown. If there's one thing worth taking away from all of this, it's pretty simple. Fat isn't the enemy here, and it never was. The real issue is everything else that's been quietly added alongside it. The water, the starch, the connective tissue, all of it sitting there in tiny print, technically declared practically invisible to anyone in a hurry. If you want to check for yourself, it genuinely takes about 30 seconds. Next time you're in the shop, pick up whatever mince you usually buy, turn it over, and actually read what's printed on the back, including anything tucked under a fold-out label. You might be surprised by what's been there the whole time, sitting in plain sight. If this video opened your eyes even a little bit, hit that hype button before you go. It really does make a difference, because it's how more people end up seeing this instead of just another advert telling them everything's fine. And drop a comment letting us know what you think, or what food you want us looking into next, because that genuinely shapes what we cover. Until next time, stay sharp, stay savvy, and protect your plate.